The aroma of cinnamon and cloves drifted through the whitewashed kitchen as Sila ground spices with practiced precision, her dark hands working the pestle in the stone mortar her grandmother had once brought from Java. It was dawn in the Cape settlement, October 1692. Through the small window, she could see her master's children playing in the courtyard, speaking a mixture of Dutch, Malay, and the clicking sounds they had learned from her own lips. The irony was not lost on her. She, who had been torn from her homeland, now seasoned the bread that would feed the very family that owned her, using recipes that bridged two worlds, while she herself existed in neither. Behind her, Mevrouw van der Merwe entered the kitchen, her wooden shoes clicking sharply against the stone floor. "The spice ships arrived yesterday," she announced in Dutch-accented Malay, a language that had become the unspoken tongue of survival in this strange, new society. "Baas wants extra hands at the harbor today." Sila nodded, understanding that her teenage son would be pulled from his studies to labor alongside grown men, his mixed heritage making him valuable as a translator, but forever marking him as something less than free. In this moment, in this kitchen, thick with the sense of two continents, lay the entire contradiction of the Dutch Cape Colony, a place where cultures melded and clashed, where intimacy grew alongside brutality, where the very foundations of a new society were being laid. In the spaces between languages, between hearts, between the powerful and the powerless. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. In the kitchens and bedrooms, the workshops and fields of the early Dutch Cape Colony, the future of an entire continent was being written in the most intimate of human interactions. Between 1685 and 1700, this windswept settlement at the edge of Africa was not merely another colonial outpost. It was a laboratory for racial hierarchy, a testing ground for the systematic relationships between oppressor and oppressed that would define South African society for centuries to come. What hung in the balance was nothing less than the soul of a nascent society. Every conversation between master and slave, every child born of forbidden unions, every act of resistance or accommodation was carving the blueprint for apartheid South Africa. The Dutch colonists were not simply establishing a refreshment station for their spice trade. They were engineering a social order that would determine how millions of people would live, love, work, and die. For the next 300 years, the stakes were deeply personal and devastatingly political. In the homes where Sila prepared meals and raised children who would never fully belong to either world, in the moments when Dutch farmers took Khoi wives, while simultaneously dispossessing their people of ancestral lands, in the daily negotiations between survival and dignity that defined every enslaved person's existence. These were the building blocks of institutional racism. This was not merely colonialism, it was the birth of a uniquely South African form of oppression, one that would evolve from the intimate brutalities of the 1690s into the mathematical precision of apartheid. Understanding how ordinary people navigated these impossible choices reveals how Systems of dehumanization take root, not in grand proclamations, but in the accumulated weight of countless small surrenders and quiet rebellions. By 1685, the Dutch East India Company's Cape settlement had evolved far beyond Jan van Riebeek's original vision of a simple refreshment station. What had begun in 1652 as a modest fort to supply passing ships had transformed into something unprecedented in the annals of European colonialism, a society where the intimate mixing of races occurred alongside their systematic separation, where cultural fusion flourished, even as legal barriers hardened into permanent caste. The VOC's directors in Amsterdam had initially envisioned the Cape as nothing more than a glorified garden, a place to grow vegetables and raise cattle for their lucrative Asian trade routes. But the realities of survival at the continent's southern tip had forced a more complex arrangement. The company needed laborers who could endure the African climate, craftsmen who understood local conditions, and intermediaries who could navigate the delicate relationships with indigenous Khoi populations. This necessity had opened the door to a multiracial society that the company's rigid Protestant sensibilities found both useful and deeply troubling. The economic foundation of this emerging world rested on a brutal triangle of exploitation. Enslaved people, captured from the company's territories in Angola, Madagascar, Indonesia, and India, provided the skilled labor that made European survival possible. Indigenous Khoi peoples, their traditional grazing lands, steadily appropriated through a combination of legal manipulation and outright theft, found themselves pushed into roles as herders and laborers on their own ancestral territory. Meanwhile, a growing population of free burghers, Dutch farmers, released from company service, established wine estates and wheat farms that would form the backbone of colonial prosperity. The social architecture that emerged from these economic pressures was unlike anything seen elsewhere in the Dutch Empire. Unlike the rigid racial hierarchies of the Americas or the commercial enclaves of Asia, the Cape developed what scholars would later call a Creole society, a world where racial boundaries existed but remained surprisingly permeable in daily practice. Company soldiers took Khoi and enslaved women as wives and concubines, creating a growing population of mixed-race children whose very existence challenged European concepts of racial purity. The VOC's response to this social complexity revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Dutch colonial rule. While company policy officially discouraged racial mixing, practical necessity made such relationships inevitable. Enslaved women from diverse Asian and African backgrounds brought crucial domestic skills, cooking, healing, textile work, child-rearing, that Dutch women either lacked or refused to perform in the harsh colonial environment. The result was a generation of children who moved fluidly between worlds, speaking multiple languages and serving as cultural bridges, even as legal codes increasingly sought to define and limit their place in society. Religious life reflected these same tensions. The Dutch Reformed Church preached Christian salvation for all souls, while simultaneously developing theological justifications for perpetual bondage. Enslaved Muslims from Indonesia maintained their faith in secret, their prayer calls echoing through the settlement at dawn, while church bells summoned their masters to Sunday services. Indigenous Khoi spiritual practices persisted in hidden spaces, their ancient connections to the land, offering silent resistance to European claims of ownership. This was the world that shaped daily life between 1685 and 1700, a society balanced precariously between intimacy and brutality, where the personal and political intersected in every kitchen conversation, every shared meal, every child's laughter echoing through the settlement's narrow streets. Dawn in the Cape settlement arrived with the sound tops of grinding, coffee beans crushed by enslaved hands, maize meal prepared for the day's bread, spices pulverized for the morning's cooking. In the homes of the free burghers, the day began in kitchens that had become laboratories of cultural fusion, where Indonesian sambal met Dutch stews, where Khoi cooking techniques transformed European ingredients into something entirely new. The houses themselves told the story of adaptation and hierarchy. Dutch families lived in whitewashed, thatched roof homes with thick walls designed to withstand the southeaster winds. Their interiors decorated with furniture imported from Amsterdam, alongside locally crafted pieces that bore the unmistakable influence of Asian and African woodworking traditions. Enslaved families crowded into single rooms behind the main house, or in converted outbuildings, their few possessions: a prayer mat from Batavia, a wooden bowl carved in Madagascar, a blanket woven from local sheep's wool, all representing the material memory of lost homelands. Clothing revealed the complex negotiations of identity that defined colonial life. Dutch women clung to European fashions despite the African heat, their starched bonnets and heavy skirts marking their determination to maintain Old World propriety. In New World conditions, enslaved women adapted more pragmatically, combining Indonesian batik techniques with locally available fabrics, creating garments that were both beautiful and functional. The children of mixed unions often dressed in a hybrid style that reflected their ambiguous social position. European cuts made from local materials, Western shoes paired with Eastern head wraps, the rhythms of daily work revealed how deeply intertwined the lives of masters and enslaved had become. In the vineyards that stretched across the Cape Flats, Khoi laborers worked alongside enslaved Malays and Madagascans, their different agricultural traditions creating new techniques for cultivating wine grapes. In African soil, the women's work was equally collaborative and hierarchical. Dutch mistresses might direct the household, but enslaved women from Indonesia brought the culinary skills that made European survival that possible, teaching their owners to preserve food in the African climate while adapting their own recipes to local ingredients. Language became the most intimate marker of this cultural blending. Children grew up trilingual by necessity, switching fluidly between Dutch with their fathers, Malay with their caregivers, and Khoi clicking sounds learned in the streets. Even adult Europeans found themselves adopting words and phrases from their enslaved workers, their speech patterns gradually shifting to accommodate the musical rhythms of Indonesian and African languages. Evening meals brought these cultural currents together around simple wooden tables. Families, both nuclear and extended, both legitimate and informal, gathered to share bread flavored with Asian spices, vegetables grown in African soil using Dutch techniques, and meat prepared according to Islamic halal traditions, that had traveled from Java to the Cape. These dinners were simultaneously scenes of intimacy and exercises in power, where enslaved women who had cooked the food were forbidden to sit at the table, and they had sat. The domestic space became a theater where the larger dramas of colonialism played out. In miniature, where love and exploitation coexisted, where cultural exchange flourished alongside racial subjugation, where the seeds of a new society were planted in the soil of profound inequality. The crack of the sjambok echoed across the settlement square as the sun reached its zenith on a Tuesday morning in March 1694. Johannes van der Stel, the governor's nephew, Endes, watched impassively as the leather whip descended again across the back of Arij, an enslaved man from Ceylon, whose crime had been teaching other slaves to read Dutch. The gathered crowd, a mixture of Dutch burghers, Khoi laborers, and enslaved onlookers, understood the message being written in blood and fear. Knowledge was power, and power belonged exclusively to those who carried European blood and Christian names. The legal architecture of control in the Cape Colony was as precisely engineered as the castle's pentagonal walls. The company's Statutes of India governed every aspect of enslaved life with mathematical brutality. Slaves could not travel more than a mile from their owner's property. Without written passes, they could not gather in groups larger than 3. They could not own property, could not marry without permission, could not testify in court against any free person, and most crucially, they could not learn to read, because literacy represented the ultimate threat to a system built on information asymmetry. Yet resistance flowed through the colony like underground water, invisible but persistent. In the wine cellars, where enslaved workers from Indonesia fermented grapes, they also fermented, and rebellion. They developed coded languages that mixed Malay, Dutch, and Portuguese, allowing them to communicate plans right under their masters' noses. They practiced subtle forms of economic sabotage, tools that mysteriously broke, crops that somehow failed, wine that turned sour despite perfect conditions. The Cape's renowned wine industry, celebrated throughout Europe, rested on the labor of people who found countless small ways to assert their humanity within systems designed to deny it. The Khoi resistance took different forms, but carried equal determination. Chief Klaas of the Chinukwa people had perfected the art of strategic accommodation, signing treaties with the Dutch while secretly moving his cattle herds beyond European reach. When company officials of demanded tribute, he provided just enough compliance to avoid military retaliation while preserving his people's core autonomy. His daughter, known to the Dutch only as Anna, served as an interpreter at the castle, while secretly passing intelligence about Dutch military movements to resistance groups in the interior. Women wielded their own forms of power. Within this oppressive system, enslaved women, like Sela, from our opening scene, understood that their roles as cooks, nurses, and caregivers gave them intimate access to Dutch family life. They used this proximity strategically, adding bitter herbs to food when masters proved particularly cruel. Sharing information between households, creating networks of support that transcended the legal boundaries, separating different enslaved communities. The most dangerous resistance was spiritual. Despite constant surveillance, enslaved Muslims continued practicing their faith in hidden spaces, their evening prayers serving as acts of defiance against Christian authority. Khoi shamans maintained their connection to ancestral lands through secret ceremonies that declared, in the face of European ownership claims, that the earth itself could never truly belong to foreign invaders. The Dutch response to this persistent resistance revealed their underlying fear. Every new regulation, every public flogging, every restriction on movement betrayed the colonists' awareness that their control rested on a foundation more fragile than they cared to admit. They ruled through terror because they understood, perhaps better than they admitted to themselves, that their entire civilization depended on the willing participation of people who had every reason to wish them gone. In the settlement's only church, the morning of Sunday, the 15th of September, 1697, witnessed a scene that would have horrified theologians in Amsterdam, as Dominee Petrus van der Spooy delivered his sermon on Christian obedience. The congregation before him represented a living contradiction to every principle of Dutch Reformed purity. In the front pews sat the Van der Merwe family, Dutch father, Khoi mother, and their children, whose features bore the unmistakable marks of two worlds. Behind them, enslaved converts from Java and Ceylon listened to scripture, read in Dutch, while silently reciting verses from the Quran they had memorized in childhood. The very air seemed thick with competing prayers, conflicting loyalties, and the impossible task of reconciling salvation with subjugation. The cultural collision that defined Cape society was most visible in its children. Young Maria van der Stel, no relation to the governor, despite sharing his name, spoke Dutch with her father, Malay with her Indonesian stepmother, and clicked in Khoi when playing with the neighborhood children. At 7 years old, she moved fluidly between worlds that adults increasingly tried to separate. Her morning prayers might be Christian, her afternoon snacks prepared according to Islamic dietary laws, and her evening stories, drawn from Khoi oral traditions, about the trickster god, Haitsi Ibib. She represented both the promise and the threat of Creole society, a living bridge between cultures and a walking challenge to racial categorization. Music became the universal language of this cultural mixing. In the evenings, the sound of the goima drum, brought by enslaved musicians from Indonesia, echoed through the settlement streets, its rhythms blending with Dutch folk melodies and Khoi traditional songs. Enslaved craftsmen carved new instruments that combined Asian designs with African wood, creating sounds that belonged to no single tradition, but somehow captured the essence of Cape life. These musical fusions occurred in the spaces between official supervision, in the moments when guards relaxed, and cultural boundaries and blurred. The kitchen remained the most intimate battlefield of cultural collision. Enslaved women from diverse backgrounds, Sumbawa, Madagascar, Bengal, Angola, found themselves forced to collaborate in preparing meals for Dutch families. Their culinary negotiations created an entirely new cuisine. Indonesian spice techniques applied to African vegetables, Malay curry methods adapted for Dutch ovens, Khoi preservation traditions used for European meat, the famous Cape Malay cuisine that would eventually define South African food culture, was born from these daily acts of survival and creativity. Religious syncretism flourished. Despite official prohibition, enslaved Muslims continued their 5 daily prayers while attending mandatory Christian services, finding ways to honor Allah within the structural requirements of Dutch Reformed worship. Khoi converts to Christianity secretly maintained their ancestral connections to the land, weaving traditional ecological knowledge into biblical interpretations of stewardship. Some enslaved people from Catholic territories in India practiced a Christianity that incorporated saints and rituals, which horrified Protestant sensibilities. Yet, collision also meant conflict. Cultural mixing created new forms of hierarchy and exclusion. Free blacks, former slaves, who had earned or bought their freedom, often proved more rigid in maintaining racial boundaries than their Dutch neighbors, desperate to distinguish themselves from those still in bondage. Mixed-race children found themselves belonging fully to neither their father's European world nor their mother's indigenous or enslaved communities, creating a third category that would eventually become the Cape-colored population. This cultural laboratory was producing something unprecedented, a society where intimate knowledge of other cultures coexisted with systematic oppression, where daily collaboration bred both understanding and resentment, where the very success of cultural fusion made racial separation seem both more necessary and more impossible to those who held power. Walk through the Bo Kaap neighborhood of modern Cape Town, and the legacy of those dawn-lit kitchens from 1692 surrounds you. In every bright painted house, every call to prayer echoing from the Awal Mosque, every grandmother stirring curry while speaking Afrikaans, seasoned with Malay words. The cultural fusion that began in enslaved women's kitchens has become the heartbeat of Cape identity, proving that oppression often creates the very cultures that eventually transcend it. The children who moved fluidly between languages in the 1690s became the ancestors of South Africa's OLS, Cape-colored, and Cape Malay communities, groups whose very existence challenged every racial classification system that followed. When apartheid architects in the 1940s attempted to categorize South Africans into neat racial boxes, they confronted the stubborn reality of 3 centuries of cultural mixing that had begun. In those early Dutch colonial homes, the Population Registration Act's notorious pencil test and other absurd methods of racial classification revealed the impossibility of unraveling identities forged in the intimate spaces of colonial society. The resistance strategies developed by Sila and her contemporaries, the coded languages, the networks of support, the use of domestic spaces for rebellion, became templates for centuries of anti-apartheid organizing. The African National Congress's underground networks, the Black Consciousness Movement's cultural pride, the United Democratic Front's community-based resistance, all drew from traditions of covert defiance that had their roots in those early colonial kitchens and workshops. Perhaps most profoundly, the daily negotiations between intimacy and brutality that defined early Cape life established patterns that would haunt South African society for generations. The ability to love across racial lines, while maintaining, of systems of racial oppression, to share culture, while denying humanity, to create beauty within brutality. These contradictions became the defining characteristics of South African society, right through apartheid to the end of apartheid. Today, when South Africans speak of the Rainbow Nation, they invoke a metaphor born in the cultural laboratories of the 1690s. The remarkable diversity of South African cuisine, music, language, and art all trace their DNA back to those early moments when survival required cultural fusion and resistance demanded creative adaptation. The legacy is both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that human creativity and resilience can flourish even in the darkest circumstances, creating light that endures long after. The systems of oppression have crumbled. In the archives of the Cape Town Museum, there sits a small wooden spoon carved from stinkwood by unknown hands sometime in the 1690s. Its handle bears the faint tracery of Indonesian carving techniques, while its bowl shows the wear patterns of African stirring motions. No name is attached to it, no story recorded, yet in its silent curves lies the entire history of early Cape society, the meeting of worlds in the most basic act of nourishment, the transformation of necessity into art, the persistence of culture, despite systematic oppression. Perhaps Sila carved it during the long evenings, after her master's family had gone to sleep. Perhaps it was shaped by hands that trembled with exhaustion, guided by memories of a grandmother's kitchen in Java. Perhaps it stirred the first bowl of curry, served in South African soil, seasoned with tears and hope. In equal measure, that spoon endures, as do the invisible hands that shaped it. In every South African kitchen, where spices still tell stories of distant homelands, where children still learn to cook in 3 languages, where recipes carry the weight of survival across centuries, there and the legacy of the early Dutch Cape Colony continues to unfold, one meal at a time.